Public discussions of a good life usually center on things like a good job, decent pay, and other material benefits. But what if, as a society, we're missing the things that truly impact happiness and human flourishing?
We are born to be in deep webs of connection with those who've gone before us as a sense of identity and carrying on a legacy, and those who will come after us.
On this episode, we speak with a local expert who shows that human connection through meaningful relationships like those within a family are usually much more important for a flourishing life than the things we usually hear about publicly. We also discuss how to recenter these principles in our public debates about our biggest challenges. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we're joined today by Dr. Jenet Erickson. She is a family fellow at the BYU Wheatley Institute and also professor at BYU, and she's also the co-author of the Utah Family Miracle report produced by Sutherland Institute jointly with the Institute for Family Studies, and Dr. Erickson is also a fellow with the Institute for Family Studies. So, Dr. Erickson, thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Nick.
We're really glad to have you here because we've been interacting together for a while. You were a panelist at the Free Forum that we hosted in March of this year, jointly with American Enterprise Institute, and of course your work on the Family Miracle paper I want to get into, but maybe start a little bit more high level because I think it's important for folks to know, number one, the research expertise you have been bringing to the issue of family relationships, and also kind of connection and meaning in our society. So often we talk about the challenges we face solely through the lens of public policy. We think, well, if there's this societal problem, we need a government program to fix it. As a good example of that in terms of the government response, this past summer, the United States Surgeon General issued an advisory about loneliness and recognizing this epidemic of loneliness we're having in the United States, and made some recommendations. So I want to start there and kind of ask that big picture question. Would you agree that loneliness is a big problem in America? And if so, what do you think is causing it? How would you help frame whatever that issue is that Americans are facing today?
Yeah, I think it's no question that it's a major problem. And that's why he's talking about it, calling it an epidemic, as severe as any other epidemic in its consequences for well-being. And so I think when we look at what's happened to the core structures of our lives, and I mean the core relationships, family structures, when we rupture those, there's going to be an increase in loneliness and a fracturing. And human beings, I love this statement from Andy Crouch. He just says, no one really flourishes unless you have others who love, know, see you, and reflect back to you who you are. From the beginnings of life, an infant emerges from the womb and they have one task. They have got to establish a deep connection of emotional relationship, emotional communication, and they can't develop apart from it. So we are hardwired to connect, and that our development really depends upon the health and strength of core relationships in order for flourishing in human beings to happen. And we've been struggling with that.
I want to ask to dive in a little deeper on the Surgeon General's advisory, because we talked about this a little bit when we were preparing for this interview, and I've seen some other folks after this advisory come out point out some criticism. Number one, it's great that such a high-level federal leader is recognizing this problem.
Yes.
As you've mentioned, I think it's something we've all kind of been recognizing collectively,
Yes.
but being able to put data to it and understand it better matters. Some of the recommendations that the Surgeon General offers are things like strengthening social infrastructure, which is things like parks, libraries, or public programs. They talk about pro-connection policies, such as public transportation or paid family leave, talk about healthcare. They also talk about digital environments, but then also talk about cultivating a culture of connection. So there's kind of a variety of things in there that they recommend.
Right.
But it seems like there was something missing at its core. And you and I talked a little bit about that.
Yes.
Can you expand on maybe where this assessment is right, but maybe more importantly, what is it missing that we need to bring to the conversation as far as how do we actually address this epidemic of loneliness?
Yes, thank you. It's so interesting because his examples in his book, Together, where he addresses this, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, the examples he uses actually go back to his own family. And what you hear missing in all of the suggestions that you gave, and certainly parks and libraries and emphasizing connection and human interaction, right, in a technoference world, is important. But what it's missing is the reason parks and libraries and all of those things have meaning at all for human beings is because of deeply core relationships. So we know the people that are voting, the people that care about libraries, the people that care about parks, their families who are concerned about the well-being of their children. And that gets us connected to the broader community. So I would say, first, it pulls us out into caring about many other things when we are married and have children. But then it also provides the structure for our own flourishing and sense of meaning and identity. A concern about the future, a concern about the well-being of others is grounded in the strength of those core relationships. And he doesn't reference those as an important kind of way to ameliorate, even though it's the foundation of the way to ameliorate loneliness.
I think a good practical example of that, I think of myself as you're talking with my own experiences within the last number of years getting married. We have 2 little boys now. And when I was single, I didn't care that much about parks. They were nice to walk through or drive by. But now with kids, all of a sudden that matters way more. But it's because I can go and take my son and walk around the park. And the park provides an environment, but it's that connection that really matters. That's what I'm going to remember.
Yes.
And you've spoken about this many times over the years, about kind of the importance of quality relationships and this essential aspect of human connection related to well-being. And I want to ask you to put that principle in context for the kinds of debates we have today about social or policy issues, because it seems that most of the ways we measure or track or talk about how people are doing, success, well-being, it's usually kind of grounded on material things or arbitrary markers. How much money are you making? What proportion of people from different demographics are in different positions of vocation? So it's things that are measurable, not that they're irrelevant, but are those really the most important things to be focused on when we're trying to measure how does a state like Utah do with a thriving life, equality, well-being, all these kinds of things? So can you talk a little bit about that, the importance of sort of recentering on this deeper connection element? Do you think that gets missed in some of these conversations?
It's so much. One of the tragic things of our day, I just heard a student talk about an uncle who had just overdosed. And I said, was he married? He was single. He'd struggled with addiction. And I said, it's so tragic to watch this deaths of despair rate increase so dramatically in a culture where we actually have more resources than we've ever had. Poverty has decreased significantly, even as we have seen an increase in this sense of despair. So Tyler Vanderwill out of Harvard, the Harvard Flourishing program, will say, we are at a time of a crisis in meaning and identity. And that's been particularly for certain subgroups of the population, men who are unmarried without a clear sense of direction for their lives, being needed, feeling like they have to provide, they have to take care of others. And we as human beings need those strong relationships. Now we could say, well, let's be pro-social, let's be pro-child. There's been that discussion, I think it's Isabel Sawhill out of Brookings will say, we've got to figure out a way to create a pro-child or a child-centric culture in a post-marriage world. And the question is, can you create a child-centered culture apart from marriage? Well, the fact is no other institution besides marriage invites parents to give their time, talents, energy, invest deeply in the well-being of other people than marriage does. We don't have a solid replacement for that. And so in line of that, I think about Carl Zimmerman, way back a founder of Harvard sociology program. The magnum opus of his work was to watch the rise and fall of civilizations over time. And as a sociologist, he was looking specifically at what were the core relationships like in this rise. If you look at Assyria, Babylon, Rome, Greece, the European empires, you see this rise and then a descent every single time. And he wanted to find out what was going on with core relationships that might have been following that pattern or influencing that pattern. And Nic, if you can believe, what he concludes is the pinnacle of a society's productivity, creativity, invention, expansion. At that time, it was deeply devoted to the nurturing of life within families. So children were a very important focus. So I'll ask my students, why in the world would a focus on children shape so much the elevation of a culture, of a civilization? And they immediately come up with answers. Well, it puts you thinking about the future. It makes you better because you've got to be better for the people who depend on you. And what it invites in our whole cultural orientation when we are thinking about children, the vulnerable among us, when we care deeply about their well-being, that happens within the structure of marriage and childbearing, then the entire civilization is elevated.
What you're saying resonates perfectly, and I'll share an experience I had a few years back. One of my work colleagues at the time, I was working somewhere else, but we were having a work discussion, and he wanted to collaborate on a project. And so he asked me, he said, okay, when you think of 10 years from now, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And I thought about it for a second, and I knew he was assuming that I was going to say something like, well, the state of Utah will look like this in 10 years, or our economy will look like this, because we were working in a public policy space. But when he asked that question, just a little bit prior, my wife and I found out that we were going to have our first baby. And so instantly, my answer was different than it would have been were I single or not preparing to become a father. And all of a sudden I thought, well, 10 years from that point, I'll have a 10-year-old little boy. What do I want my community, my state, and my country to look like for him?
Yes.
And it totally changed the entire frame of how I approached even my work, the things that we do professionally. It seems like that's what you're talking about, is it shifts the lens to something that's bigger than just myself in a very positive way.
Yes. I just had a student on the front row. I heard him say in response to a comment, they were just talking together. He's married and he's preparing to go to graduate school. And he said, getting married meant I got off the couch and I'm not just playing video games. I've got people who need me, this wife, and an aspiration and people expecting the best of him. And he could just, we hadn't talked about that at all. He could just feel in himself how it was shaping the way he was orienting his life. And that's what Zimmerman's talking about. Now, when cultures fell, right, they went from an orientation around nurturing life in others to what he identified as an atomistic orientation, which is where the individual becomes the primary central focus. And that's when decline happened, a more atomistic orientation.
That's a good segue. I wrote down, because I wanted to briefly quote something you mentioned. As I mentioned, we co-hosted a free forum with American Enterprise Institute back in March, and you were a panelist during the family panel portion of that. And you kind of talk about the same thing, that the way society sort of implicitly, sometimes explicitly approaches what the good life looks like. And you mentioned that society is kind of pushing a hierarchy of needs that's designed around this idea of, and I'll quote you, an isolated, pleasure-seeking, autonomous individual that kind of sits atop the pyramid of that hierarchy of needs. But you offered a better analogy of a tree that with deep roots and strong branches. So can you maybe, I guess, give in a minute or two before we need to take a break, give sort of a social critique? It's a big question for a short answer, but of what we get wrong in society about this is what the good life looks like. I'm an individual who can kind of do whatever I want versus, no, I'm rooted in something meaningful. What's the difference that we need to walk away with?
Well, it seems like looking around us, we see the implications of a society oriented around the ideal life is me not having binding to anyone, no obligations to anyone. I'm free to do at will what would pursue pleasure for me. And that's kind of been how we think about the good life. And it has left us starving. It's no wonder we see such an increase in mental health challenges, such an increase in alienation, loneliness, perception, as Tyler Vanderbilt said, a crisis in meaning and identity. And the reason is because we are wired, we are born to be in deep webs of connection with those who've gone before us as a sense of identity and carrying on a legacy, and those who will come after us. And that's that tree metaphor, is we are bound together in webs of profound connection, and that inspires us with meaning, a sense of identity. It is the flourishing life.
So we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to build on this and get into some of the evidence of the trend lines that are happening here in Utah and throughout the country. And of course, still talk about this a little bit in the policy context, because that's what we do here as a public policy think tank. But there's so much that you're saying that I think we'll want to revisit during the conversation to pinpoint for our listeners that the message of society about what constitutes a fulfilling life has largely been wrong.
Yes.
You can do whatever you want, no constraints,
Yes.
no obligations. That's not actually what brings happiness and meaning. It's these deeper connections and obligations in a good way, because you are needed to create something of value bigger than yourself. Any final way to sort of capture that before we go to break?
You said so beautifully. It seems like marriage really is, we think of it as commitment to the other person and a validation that we get for ourselves, but it's really a commitment to a project beyond either of us, bigger than either of us are, bigger than our love. And it's that commitment, that devotion to something bigger than ourselves, that actually gives the meaning, builds the intimacy, strengthens the identity, and leads to flourishing children, because this is a devoted couple to a project bigger than they are.
Well, let's get into that a little bit more. Marriage and children, kind of how those things impact some of these trends, and what is the appropriate role of policy and policymakers, but also for each of us. So we'll get into that a little bit more detail. We're talking with Dr. Jenet Erickson about family issues and family policy, and maybe in a better way, family culture in our society, and what we can do to recenter these really important emotional connections that are better barometers of human flourishing than some of the other things we focus on. So continue right after this break. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Jenet Erickson, who's been talking to us about family, culture, society, and what are the truly better markers for human flourishing and happiness. We're also going to tie that into some public policy considerations. But before we continue, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. There you can get access to short clips from this discussion, as well as previous episodes that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms. Just go to wherever you like to get your shows, type in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and click that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Jenet, to continue this conversation, let's shift a little bit into what are the public policy considerations? What should policymakers be thinking about? And all of us as voters, what should we be expecting of our elected officials? And I want to mention, as we said at the top, you were one of the authors for the Utah Family Miracle, this report produced a few months ago, jointly between Sutherland Institute and the Institute for Family Studies. And this report, I think, unveiled something that a lot of folks in Utah didn't know, that even though we're kind of held up as the best state for families, we have high rates of family formation, which is still true, but the trend lines are actually going down. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, from that report, first, is there anything that you think needs to be a key takeaway that Utah voters ought to know and remember when we're having these kinds of family conversations that you and the other writers were able to uncover in the research for that report? What are some key takeaways you think are worth noting?
I think one of the beautiful things about that report is it just pulls out something we take for granted, which is economies are based in human capital and well-being of human beings. And based on our previous discussion, core relationships are fundamental to human well-being. So when we look at Utah being recognized for its remarkable economic strength and growth in the midst of, difficult things across the nation, Utah has been thriving. And when we look at what is at the core explanation of that, we're going to find the stability of family relationships. So 9 in 10 children are raised in Utah County in a 2-parent household. That's just remarkable relative to the broader nation. We have the percent of marriage is the strongest predictor that we find of economic mobility, median income. All of these economic metrics that we care deeply about are based in the stability and percentage of marriage. So we just sort of take that for granted because we live in a family-focused culture, but it's so remarkable what it does. I've seen indications about the importance of family for entrepreneurship. So something about family stability creates a culture that allows for entrepreneurship to thrive, which is Utah as well. And so I think just appreciating where economic strength comes from, it's grounded in human capital. Human capital is grounded in human well-being. Human well-being is grounded in strong core relationships that are stable and loving, and that's going to be the essence of our economy. Now, we got to remember that because, as you noted, there's a drop in the marriage rate. There's a decrease in fertility. We talked about the importance of children for keeping us centered, growing, developing. And so appreciating what it is that allows for economic thriving and recognizing it so that you can strengthen and maintain it and help where we see a decrease in marriage, for example.
I want to kind of test out something with you and see if it holds water and if the reframe is appropriate, what I'm suggesting. So the perception that I have is that most of our societal conversations around upward mobility for the next generation are basically exclusively focused on education. I guess education and vocation as well, because you need a strong economy, you need good job pathways. But it's kind of been this truism for all of my life, for many decades in this country, that the most important and most impactful engine of upward mobility for the next generation was education, specifically the formalized public ed system with higher ed as well. But with all of this data around the family, would it be fair to say that, yes, education is really, really important. No one's discounting that. But actually, family is a bigger variable that impacts upward mobility and opportunity for kids. Is that the right reframe? And how do we make that reframe?
Yes, I think it's powerful to think that it's sort of a 3-pronged, and we've left one of them out. That is family, work, right, and career or monetary access, and that they all work together strongly. You cannot talk about one apart from the other. So that would help us understand the current conversations around the 2-parent advantage, for example, and suggesting that economically, this is so powerful, this pulling together, the pooling of resources, and then what it allows for building human capital in the children who come into those relationships. You also remember, I think the last podcast noted Raj Chetty's work, where he looks at Utah, he's a Harvard and I think it's Stanford as well, but looks at what predicts upward mobility, because all of us are deeply concerned about what's going to help people come out of poverty. As you noted, exclusively the orientation publicly has been, well, we've got to increase monetary access for people and education. What was missing is what he found as the key predictor, which is the likelihood of people being around marriages. So the proportion of marriages in a community actually was the single strongest predictor of the likelihood of people coming out of poverty, whether or not you were in a married family. So if you were a single parent family but surrounded by married families, you had increased chances of coming up out of poverty.
Why do you think that is? Because as you're mentioning in our conversation in a previous episode with the Utah Marriage Commission, and the great work they're doing here in Utah, and we've referenced many times Melissa Carney, who's a Brookings scholar and an economist at the University of Maryland, who wrote the book The 2-Parent Privilege. That's kind of another thing in addition to this report, a lot of the writing that you've done and some of the work you've done with the Institute for Family Studies, helping to elevate this notion of a married 2-parent household is hugely impactful for kids.
Yeah.
So this is kind of being elevated. Why do you think it is, though, that traditionally the conversation has, to put it simply, kind of ignored family structure and focused on things like education and other things? Is it that most people just didn't think family structure really was as impactful as other things like education? Or was it that everybody kind of has known that family is kind of the biggest variable with these things for a long time, but it felt uncomfortable to talk about, or there were no clear answers? Why do you think there's been such a reluctance in policy circles or in public discourse to talk about the importance of family structure until now?
Yeah, really fantastic question. And I think to highlight, we really are at a unique moment in terms of my experience around family, because you've got Melissa Carney, who would consider herself a progressive. And she's saying we cannot ignore, in all this economic data, there is nothing so powerful as marriage for strengthening economic well-being for the couple and for their children in the future. And you just can't deny the statistics. At the same time, you have Nicholas Kristof writing the New York Times calling it the privilege liberals have ignored, the one privilege liberals ignore. So a focus on privilege. And he's saying we're ignoring the central privilege, which is what it means to grow up with married parents. And then you've got David Brooks on the heels of it saying, I want to take people by the lapels. Here's a progressive writer, right? And referencing his own experience of being married, then divorced, and then writing his book, The Second Mountain, as he discovers relationships are everything. Stable marriages are everything. So he says, I want to take young people, as he looks at the decreased marriage rate, and he also looks at the data, parents being ambivalent about their children's future marriages. So parents not caring as deeply about future marriages at a rate of like 20% for their children as they do for their economic, financial independence. So like 80% care deeply about children's financial independence. Only 20% care deeply about their children's future marriages and children. And David Brooks says, I want to take people by the lapels and just look them in the face and say, everything good will come from the strength of those core relationships. Don't ignore its importance. So when you say why, I think they're wrestling with why have we ignored it? It's almost like, and I think it's tied up in a few things. One would be, it seems to have a moral element to it. There's something about marriage that evokes sensitivity around its moral nature. And I think that's because it's human beings caring for one another in deeply committed ways. And there's ambivalence around that, I think, partly because in an effort to increase equity, this would be one place for women, having control over their fertility was seen as a very liberating thing, made possible in the 70s through widespread access to contraception and abortion. And then the assumption was, I have total control over my fertility. And that questions about how one manages that, right, that might bring in marriage or other things could suggest a change in that control. Now, at the same time, the other big piece is, well, look at all the people who have experienced divorce because they could not have an alternative. It would not have been healthy to stay in that marriage. And are we stigmatizing them, the people that are doing so much to maintain alone what two people can barely do together, right? And so I think all of those are pieces that have kept us from really talking about it. And I think Melissa Carney, Nicholas Kristof, David Brooks are saying, we cannot ignore this anymore. Rather than being afraid to talk about it, we've got to talk about it and do what we can to strengthen the likelihood that this increases.
So we need to take one more break, and I think for our third segment, we'll get into some more of the policy details, maybe some takeaways for policymakers. But for now, let's try and, I guess, frame this as advice for our listeners, or sort of a how-to guide, because as you've articulated very well, there are these other kind of concerns that have maybe been on the periphery of this issue that have prompted a lot of folks in our public discourse to not want to talk about it. So for those of us who read things from Melissa Carney, from you, from Brad Wilcox, from these other writers or thinkers that are talking about, look, the data and evidence is there of the importance of marriage for kids. How can all of us who say, yes, this makes sense, this resonates, I want to go and articulate this idea to people who might be skeptical or to people who might have some discomfort talking about it, what's the right approach? How can I go to someone who maybe is not persuaded yet on this and say, here is why marriage and family is so important to society, and here's why marriage specifically is so important to kids, and we should be able to and be committed to talking about that in our public dialogue? what's the message that's going to convey that without shaming single mothers, without making people who are maybe adults who long to be married but are not for whatever reason,
Yes.
making them feel like they're somehow less than? How do we articulate that message that's clear-eyed to the data, cognizant of wanting to create a better life for the next generation, but also compassionate to folks who might have a different circumstance and convincing to those we're trying to persuade?
Yeah.
What's the right approach?
What a question, right, Nick? I couldn't help but think of a few examples from my own experience. I was older when I got married. My husband and I were 34. It was a miracle to find each other. I think there's a lot of concern today about who can I marry? You're telling me to get married. Who can I marry? The decreased marriageability of men being a factor. But I loved that across that path, there was this strong sense in my church community and in my family that you are part of us. And we need the favorite aunts and uncles. We need people who carry at their core the truth about our human being, which is we are relational by nature. And whether or not I have found and been able to create the kind of marriage that I want, yet at my core, I know this is what human beings are made for and that we carry that. Having said that, my husband, his parents divorced when he was 6. And he will talk poignantly about the moment when his mom said, Michael, who do you want to live with? And he could not answer. He'll tell our children, I couldn't answer. How could I choose between granddad and Nana? And I think recognizing the pain that we have experienced, which is inherent to mortality, because we're not perfect human beings yet, and we will rupture relationships. We will not be true in relationships. There will be fracturing. But rather than denying the pain and saying that all of these experiences are equal to decrease stigmatizing, it's actually more healing to acknowledge the pain of that rupture and what can be done to change the future. So for him to be able to have a family with his children and a stable marriage is just the greatest fulfillment of his life. And to recognize the wounding of his own childhood and what he has the potential to create anew for the future. So rather than being afraid to talk about it, it's talking about it more in ways that bring healing to a culture that has been fractured by the rupturing of relationships.
That's incredibly powerful. I think that, let's take a break and then let's continue talking about how we take some of these ideas and translate them into the policy sphere. There's some recommendations in the Family Miracle Report that you were an author for, and there's some ongoing conversations here in Utah and around the country thanks to this really unique movement that you're articulating that we're in right now about elevating the importance of the family as an institution and a key driver of not just success and upward mobility, but meaning and purpose. So I like the idea of kind of pairing those together. So we'll continue. We have another segment with Dr. Jenet Erickson on defending ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back after this break.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Dr. Jenet Erickson about family issues in our state and country and also how that can translate into next steps in the policy world. Before we continue the conversation, I want to mention if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this conversation that we encourage you to post on social media. You can also use in your conversations about these issues with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, all the major platforms. Just go to wherever you like to get your shows, type in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and click that subscribe button. You can also subscribe to YouTube if you prefer to watch all this great content there. That's defendingideas.org. Jenet, as we finish out our conversation, I think it's always helpful to have kind of a what's next mindset. This has been incredibly powerful and incredibly compelling ideas you're sharing about reorienting ourselves individually and societally around the importance of these crucial relationships, specifically in marriage and families and parents and kids. But I also think there's always an important public policy component to these kinds of things. And so specifically, when we look at the Utah Family Miracle paper that you were an author for, there's a number of recommendations in there, and I want to get your context added for two of those. We talked a lot in the previous segment about the impact of marriage on child outcomes, the wealth of data that's available there. One of the specific policy recommendations that you helped to write is to include family structure data tracking in public-facing data. So things like when we measure outcomes for kids, that usually breaks out these outcomes by race and ethnicity, by gender, by geography, by income, all these different things. Family structure usually isn't included in that. Talk to us about why that alone seems kind of like a wonky data thing, but just including that in the data tracking, why would that be an impactful next step?
Yeah, such a great question. It's interesting. I have a sister that's an administrator at a high school, and she does a lot of counseling work with the students. And she was just noting last year, she said, it would be so helpful if I knew which children came from ruptured family relationships. Now, the reason she said it is super consistent with the data. Here's my husband, one of those who's experienced divorce and is marvelous, a marvelous person. But there is no question there is an increased risk for children who grow up in an unstable, in a non-married, even a biological married family. And those risks show up in every developmental domain. So wouldn't it do a service to the children that we're working with and just a reflection of what's going on in our broader society to know where are the people at increased risk, which means a measure of family structure. And I think we could measure the well-being of society by keeping track of family structure, knowing how important it is for human flourishing. We could also know where the risks are and where we need to put in energy and where we need to put more support if we measured that variable, because it's so important to our human well-being.
Related to that, and this is another topic that came up at the Free Forum in March that you spoke at, and also in the Family Miracle paper, is this idea of the success sequence, this set of I guess, data metrics that point out life milestones. Initially started with Brookings, which is not a conservative organization. American Enterprise Institute has replicated, Institute for Family Studies has, federal agencies have replicated this. So the data is very well documented of the success sequence of if you finish your high school education, you work full time, and if you're going to have kids, you get married first and then have kids within that marriage. 97% of those folks do not experience poverty. One of the recommendations in here is we got to use this data of these really impactful milestones to equip the next generation. Talk us through that. Why is that not something that we should just leave to say, well, it's common sense. Everybody kind of gets it. We don't need to talk about it or promote it or equip people to accomplish it. Why is it something we should rally around?
Yes. Well, I think it's powerful. It brings up that we really are in what we might call a divided America. Kay Himowitz calls it caste in America. We don't have a caste system, but when we look at the trajectories for children, they are so divergent based on whether or not they grow up in a married family and with married parents. And so we really are, the divorce rate among those who are more educated is very small relative to the proportion. Where you might have 10%, you're going to have 78% divorce rate or 84% growing up with unmarried parents. So, and the risks are just very, very different. So what I think the success sequence highlights is that in some segments of the population, the more educated, they aren't having children before they get married. They'd never even think of doing that. In our lower educated, more vulnerable parts of our population, that's all they've ever seen. They've never seen relationships that were stably married. And so it's infusing a belief in that success sequence, especially for those who are most vulnerable. And encouraging, right? Which includes the whole piece of helping men be more marriageable. That means increasing the likelihood that they can have jobs, academies that are oriented towards career development, as well as teaching the reality that your life trajectory will be so different if you can follow this sequence, especially for that subgroup of the population.
There's another thing you're mentioning that has come up in these conversations recently about simply, and this is something that we talked about with the Marriage Commission folks on that previous episode, that simply sort of quote unquote preaching the success sequence alone and then walking away and saying, okay, we gave it to you, you got to do it, is necessary. It's a very important first step, but is not sufficient. You mentioned some other things about some policy interventions, but sort of institutional supports. There's a cultural norm aspect, and also sort of you look at a child or a young person, how can we take the cultural and societal institutions that are around them, and have those institutions rally around that young person and say, this is a good thing to strive for.
Yeah.
We are going to help you in trying to strive for that.
Yes.
Would you say that that's another piece that shouldn't be missed, is there are institutional supports that we want to bring to the table as well?
Yes. I think when we think about the all hands on deck approach, it's removing the penalty to marriage, which can so often be encountered by those who are more vulnerable. So they can access resources, right, that help facilitate food and healthcare and other things only up to a certain measure of income. So there's a disincentive to marry and report your income together, because that means you won't qualify for the same suite of resources that you had previously. And we've got tons of those barriers that are in place, which would mean we need to increase the level at which people can still access those resources and then incentivize them solidifying that relationship through marriage. So there's the removing marriage penalty, and at the same time, there's putting in pro-marriage policies or orientations, cultural ideas. And I think that's how we increasing the marriageability of men, right? Making them more able to sustain family life, and cultural ideas around the success sequence. But then I think, Nic, recognizing many of those in that more fragile aspect of our society are struggling with tremendous relational poverty. They've known infidelity, addiction, incarceration. They've seen a merry-go-round of relationships, of cohabiting parents, a lot of sexual abuse, a lot of sexual violation. And so it's really healing that too that's essential, because you can't just form a marriage that's going to be stable without help from healing from trauma, addressing the fact of not having seen a stable marriage. And that also is an important dimension that we need to address as a society.
I'm glad you kind of circled back to the importance of relationships, because it's the note that I want to end on as we're about out of time. And as I mentioned during the break, we could talk about this for hours, and we'll hopefully have you back on the show to discuss these things more as these ideas progress. But with respect to relationships, two things come to mind to help to kind of, again, leave our listeners with something on a personal level. What can I do differently in my life? And what can I do differently in my civic life to help these ideas be more part of the norm of our culture, because they're very powerful, and the evidence shows that. And those two things are, when you talk about relationships and the importance of those, I've thought often about sort of the relationship hierarchy. And this is adapted a little bit from Dave Ramsey, who often talks about this. But the way I would say, okay, if I were to rank the relationships and order them and how do I prioritize what's most important to me, it would be, for me personally, my relationship with God, my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my kids. Those are the three most important things in my life, and I need to always be cognizant of how to orient my life towards those. And then, yes, of course, my relationship with my neighbors, and I mean that in the biblical sense, that friends, coworkers, the community that we try and serve through our vocational efforts. And if that can help guide my life personally, when that does guide my life, I see the impact of that. And as another kind of anecdote, recently my wife bought us a couple of 5-year memory journals. I don't know if anyone's ever seen them, but it's literally it's a 1 line a day journal. So each day there's only room for 1 line, and it's timed out so you would fill it up over the course of 5 years. And as I have not been as diligent every day as I should be, things get interrupted. But when I do it, and I sit down at the end of that, think, okay, what's the biggest thing from today that's the most important that I want to remember 5 years from now? Most of what I put in there is not work.
Yeah.
I love work. I love that we get to make a difference in our society and provide for our families, and it's deeply meaningful. But probably 90% of the things that go in that journal, when I really think at the end of the day, what is worth writing down is interactions with my kids, with my wife, with our family, with our this institutional unit that we've created. So I just say that to kind of bookend and invite your final thoughts of what's a reminder that we all need as far as what's most important in life, and then how can we carry that with us when we talk about these public issues and when we do start to talk about what public policy should do in response.
Yeah. Nic, so beautiful. It seems like all the evidence of the effect of fracturing just confirms we are deeply relational beings, and that these core relationships They're the reason. So you talked about the focus that you have in your life on these relationships. The flip side is when those relationships are strong, then human beings are flourishing. So we end the 75-year grant study, the Harvard grant study, 75 years long. He ends up by saying, George Vaillant concludes it by saying, happiness is love, full stop. The biggest study in America's history, longest term, Harvard student body, and it's going to confirm over the lifetime, everything that matters is bound up in these core relationships of life. And so we carry that message in our hearts and our minds through our policies, through our orientations, religiously and in our communities, and especially at home. And that really is the essence of being.
Well, Jenet, I want to thank you so much for coming and talking with us. That we've covered a lot of things that I think are impactful on a personal level and on a policy level, and being able to channel the importance of what matters, what gives personal meaning, and how should our society essentially structure itself in a way to help those things to flourish. So thank you so much for lending your time and your expertise and sharing your experiences with us. And we hope to continue these conversations and help to advance these ideas as we go.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for caring about it.
We have one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We're so grateful to Dr. Jenet Erickson for being our guest this week. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. As we close out this episode, I want to leave you with 3 key talking points from our discussion with Jenet Erickson. Number 1, so many of the social or policy challenges we're facing today, like high rates of deaths of despair, mental illness, and others, are often not directly caused by public policy failures, but by breakdowns in core institutions of civil society that typically foster human connection and relationships, in particular, the family. Keep that top of mind whenever we're discussing challenging issues. Number 2, on a personal level, we should each take stock of our personal relationships. Are they organized by priority in the right order? If not, how can we reprioritize? This approach will not only bless our own lives, but also positively affect those around us and our community and state as a whole. And number 3, there can be an important role for public policy on these kinds of issues. In particular, we should look for ideas that will help strengthen things like family relationships, rather than distracting from or even replacing them. Well, we hope you feel better equipped to defend the ideas we discussed today. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, essentially wherever you get your shows. And visit defendingideas.org for more episodes, short clips, and more ways to watch. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's all for this episode. Thanks so much for listening to Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.